there is an expectation that principals are in charge and superintendents are in charge. So there's much more conformity that they can say it and you'll do it. So it's a different world. So it's very important in the PLC world for there to be buy-in by the leadership of the school.
Absent of good leadership, the PLC practices are not sustainable. You are going to have pockets of success in a school with a team where members of the team are really bought into doing the work. But if the leadership is not supportive of that and does not create the system that allows for it, it will not sustain.
What if you turn hardship into greatness, anger into serenity? Everything changes. Make your life a masterpiece. Welcome, I'm Yanik, your host, and now joining me, Heather Dillard and Terry Goodin to discuss a mindset for success. Have you ever wondered what's a mindset of success? Why a mindset of success is critical in order to strive? And lastly, how to develop a mindset for success. Welcome, Heather Dillard and Terry Goodin to the show. It's such a pleasure for finally having you to discuss your beautifully written book, Mindset for Success, published by Solution 3. Welcome, such a pleasure.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be with you.
To start, let's introduce yourself in one powerful sentence.
Oh, that's a hard one.
It is.
You want to go first?
Sure. I'll go first. I think of myself as a people-centered person who attempts to support the learning of others and model the learning myself. Is that good enough?
I think that's a good answer.
Fantastic.
That sounds like you. So I think of myself as a professional learner, having never reached the point of learning everything, but always trying to learn more and wanting to do that with others, not wanting to do it in isolation, but wanting to learn together.
So to lay a little bit the groundwork and that our listeners really understand who you are and how you actually got together to write this book, let's start with your life and your growing up. How was it? And were there any indicators that you ultimately will pursue the path of education and then ultimately becoming an author?
Go ahead.
I can go first this time.
Okay.
So I will say that becoming an author was never in my thoughts as a little girl, but being a teacher was. And from a very little girl, I would play school in my grandmother's basement. And she had this little bench, a little child-sized bench, which I later learned was her father's bench when he was in a one-room schoolhouse. It came out of that schoolhouse. And I would get my cousins there and line them up, and I would be their teacher. And if they weren't there, I'd get my stuffed animals and my dolls, and I would be their teacher. And so I always wanted to be a teacher and intended to stay in the K-12 classroom my whole career. But as I'd been there a while, I started receiving student teachers who would come to my class for me to help them learn how to become teachers. And I loved that opportunity. And so from there, I decided to finish my doctoral studies for that purpose, to work with student teachers. And that led me to Middle Tennessee State University, where I met Terry. And in my doctoral studies, I had studied professional learning communities a lot, exclusively almost. And I tried to develop what I had learned there in the collaborative team that we were working on, even though that wasn't a big part of higher education. It's just how I did work. And the work that he did in problem-based learning just fit together so nicely that we became a really good team. And years later, this book kind of grew out of that.
Yes, so we've been working together since 2013, I guess.
12 years.
So we are kind of the example of how to do professional learning communities at the higher education level, if you think about it. It's fairly common at the K-12 level, but not at higher ed, and Heather introduced me to that. My background, going back to when I was a kid, was not to be a teacher, although I'm the son of a teacher and a librarian who also was a school administrator at one point in her life. And so I saw my mother and what she did to become a teacher and what she did in the field of education, and didn't realize that it was sticking with me as well. But my interest was in anything and everything adventurous when I was a kid. I was not the greatest student because I could never figure out why they wanted me to learn what they wanted me to learn. And so if it didn't interest me, I simply didn't pay attention. And so as I came up through the system, I realized that they were teaching me what they wanted me to learn and to know, but it didn't much matter to me, so I focused on things like the arts, music and whatnot, anything creative. And so life just kind of happened along those lines. I was always creating something, doing something exciting, but it wasn't exactly related to school. And it wasn't until I I dropped out of college, went to work, and then I got the opportunity to start thinking about education again, and went back to school after 17 years, finished my undergraduate, master's, and doctorate all in a line, because suddenly I realized that what I wanted to do was to do something to change education. Because I felt like there were a lot of kids out there who were like I was, who didn't know why they were learning what they were. And so I wanted to affect that. I wanted to influence that. And when I got to Vanderbilt University, where I did my doctoral work, I was introduced to this thing called problem-based learning, and the light went on. So I realized that using problem-based learning, I could answer that question of why. Why am I learning this? It is to apply it to some real-life situation that mattered to me. So suddenly, math mattered because I wanted to fly an airplane. The sciences mattered because I wanted to be a scuba diver. So anything that I was doing that was exciting and recreational and adventurous, I suddenly realized that there was a connection with schooling that I could make. And so I decided to pursue problem-based learning and learning sciences in general. So I did that and found my way into higher education, teaching about problem-based learning and teaching people how their brain worked and how their minds worked for learning, and getting it to a real down-to-earth perspective on how to use education in everyday life. So then when I met Heather, and she introduced me to this idea of the professional learning community, I realized that I had another dimension here that I could offer, which was a deep problem-based way of looking at life and doing it in a collective group where we could work not only wisely on our own, but wisely in a group of people to accomplish institutional change. So that's the exciting thing that brought us together. And the book, of course.
Before we dive specifically, into the specifics of the book, let's just unpack a little bit PLCs. And I'm curious, what are some of the big roadblocks that you face when you really introduce that in higher education?
In higher education, professional learning communities can be problematic for a few reasons. And one of those reasons is because a lot of professors work in silos. They don't work with other people, and so they don't have to collaborate. And because they don't have to, it's not part of their workload. And working in isolation, they develop their curriculum, and they don't see a need to work with others. They have what's the term that we use for in higher ed a lot?
Autonomy.
Autonomy, yes, professional autonomy.
We totally have
And so they rest on that. I have the autonomy to not have to do this, and so there's no one that's, in a sense, forcing them to do it. But I don't necessarily think it needs to happen in all parts of higher education, but in schools of education where learning is the main point, learning about learning, and where it is so prevalent in K-12 schools, I think it is absolutely essential that colleges of education operate as a professional learning community, and that they are demonstrating that work that they're doing to their prospective teachers, so that they enter the K-12 world understanding the collaborative nature that they're getting into in this field of education.
And I think, too, to add to that, in higher education, Heather mentioned the role of autonomy. We can be terribly independent, to put it politely. But what it takes is for there to be people in a situation where they recognize the worth of each other, and they understand that as a professor, I don't know everything. And so the more that you realize that you don't know everything, the more you begin to value your colleagues around you, and the more important it becomes to work together to solve a common problem. Mm-hmm. And anytime you have that need for a common problem to be solved, it's a place for a professional learning community to thrive. And so professional learning communities can exist and should exist in other departments like music or history or liberal arts, whatever, where you have a common problem. We want to create students who are excellent at whatever that is. And so that is our problem, and together we can solve it easier than we can solve it by ourselves. So that kind of respect for one another, valuing one another as individuals, and that sense of collegiality that comes from that is very important. And PLC concepts emerge from that. PLC is not exclusive to education. In fact, it began as learning organizations with the work of Peter Senge. And that goes back to the business world. Mm-hmm. So there's a root in learning organizations that is quite diffuse.
Mm-hmm.
Would you agree that collaboration is also a skill that has to be learned, developed, and it takes a lot of resilience and energy to work and collaborate with different people? I think we have to underline, but it's probably one of the most important skills especially for the future, but right now.
It absolutely is true. And in our book, there's a chapter that's just on that one notion, that collaborative skills have to be learned, and you learn by doing, right? You can't just read about collaboration, you have to do it. And it requires a level of trust. A trust in your colleagues that you are collaborating with, but also a level of trust in the process of what you're collaborating about and how you're doing it. And that's a big part of what we tried to write about. There's so much literature about the professional learning communities at work model. And we weren't trying to change the model. We were trying to give a method that allowed people to think about what they're thinking while they were doing the work. And that's what the beauty of problem-based learning does. It causes you to stop and really think about your thinking and to categorize your thinking into things that you actually know versus things you think you know. And then there's things that you need to know. And that was a really big part of the work that we that wrote about in this book.
And now I really want to precisely dive into the book, because it's really think this, do this, and you give really a very specific, a very powerful method to actually apply it immediately so that collaboration will actually work in a very effective and powerful way. And so let's start really and unpack this for us. Thinking, thinking is something that can be empowering or disempowering. And now tell us why thinking should be empowering and not necessarily disempowering.
Well, I think that we're getting sort of to the root of part of what your podcast is about, Why Knowledge Matters. To focus upon the whole learning process, we think about it in kind of a cycle: thinking, learning, and growing. So it would be hard to separate thinking from knowledge, because there's something about the beginning of the learning process that requires us to be aware of something, and then to be cognizant of the fact that we don't know what that is. And then that learning process can begin at that point. We focus a lot in the field of education on thinking about thinking, which is, a fancy word for that is metacognition. And there's a lot of research that's done on metacognition. The idea of thinking about your own thinking, which is reflecting upon what's happening as you are learning. How am I learning that? I'm learning it, but how am I learning it? Am I committing that to short-term memory, to long-term memory? Am I using music to make myself remember something? Am I using mnemonics? Am I connecting one thing with something that I already know, which is kind of a scaffolding approach? So you think about the different processes that are involved in helping your brain to learn better. And so it begins with that. That's the root of it. And we hope that people, learners, will begin to consider, how best do I learn? And is it different in one situation as opposed to another? And how is it? I'm learning, but how do I know I am? And how's it sticking with me or not? So empowering is another idea, Yanik, that we think about a lot, which is that we can choose to empower ourselves. This is a thing that I think is very important to focus on, which is that oftentimes when we think about being empowered, we're thinking about somebody else giving us power. I am empowering you to do so and so. You have the power, I give it to you. Whereas in this model that we're thinking about, it is that I am giving myself power. I am claiming the power that is within my mind and within my brain that I can have. No one has to give it to me, and no one can take it from me. So this is that whole concept of agency, and having a learner to understand that they can be a lifelong learner by using these kinds of processes, by thinking about thinking and by applying that thinking in real life situations. Does that answer your question?
And now also you mentioned in the book, you also have intention traps. And please relate and explain what an intention trap is and how really thinking has the power and empowering, why it helps to overcome these intention traps that you mention in the book.
So I think what he's talking about is there's this gap between knowing and doing, and we can know that we should do something, but then not do it. And a lot of that has to do with our mindset, whether or not we believe we can or believe we can't. As a matter of fact, we started our book, I brought it today, with a well-known children's book, which is The Little Engine That Could. And, you know, in that book, there were 4 trains that stopped, but only one believed they could. There were 3 others that didn't. And we wonder what might have happened if all 4 trains worked together and said, hey, let's do this together and see, you know, what would have come of that. But when you think about, when you put teams of teachers together, you may have 4 engines represented there, right? And only one thinks they can. And the 3 others are having negative thoughts that are really impeding the ability of the team to grow. And that was one of the things that we wanted to do to empower that teacher that thinks they can, who is basically being forced to work with this collaborative team of teachers who won't engage in the process. But if they have this method of organizing their thoughts and saying, okay, this is the problem of practice that we're dealing with. Let's don't assume we can't do it. Let's talk about what we can do. What do we know? Mm-hmm. And so really what that does is give them a way to begin the process of overcoming that knowing and doing gap.
Mm-hmm. So it's, if we feel that we don't have power, let's look at this and think, what power do we have? And let's build from there and say, where do we need more power and how do we get it? And so our process helps people kind of organize that thinking and walk their way through it. But another point about the intention gap is that we show this in the book, this think this, do this model. And we did that purposefully because it's one thing to think and to say, all right, I agree with the theory that you're presenting here. But it's another thing to take that and to put it into action. And unless we put that think this into action, what good has it done? So we put in think this, the whole list of things that we want you to know about and to think and to believe, and then do this. Put this into action by doing these following things in your practice. And so we're very specific about here's how you do that. Here's how. So if it works, if it doesn't work, it doesn't work, but if it works, it's beautiful. So we want to show how to put it into action, not just think about it. And it's not enough for us to have an intention to do good. If we have a great intention, it's wonderful. But if we don't put that intention into action, it's just an intention. Mm-hmm. And that's what the trap is. Well, I meant well, but you didn't do well. So you have to think well, mean well, and do well. So that's that intention trap that we're talking about.
And I would add, one of the great things about Solution Tree as a publishing company is they produce reproducibles for every one of their books, so that even if you don't purchase the book, you can go to their website and download for free those reproducibles. So for every think this, do this in the book, there is a reproducible that goes along with that you can download at the website.
And you can still buy the book.
Yes, you can.
And now just quickly for the listeners, so if you really want to empower yourself, you want to make sure that you have a mindset for success, go now on solutiontree.com and buy a copy of Dr. Goodin and Dr. Dillard's book now. So just come back quickly what you have said, because this is something I think it's so crucial, because what you're really making the case, and that's why the book is so powerful, is that you have to also first and foremost empower yourself in your thinking. So in other words, your thinking affects whatever you do. So if you have a positive thought, it's much more likely that you take action. Whereas if you have a negative thought, you will just basically stay in your mind. And as you said, you stay just there with your intention and nothing happens. And I think most people, and actually also I'm curious what you think about that, but I think most people in this world have wonderful intentions, but most of us don't really act on these. How come?
We think about that a lot. You know, we go to conferences as university professors. We're always going to conferences. And here's the thing we notice is that people go to a conference, they hear a new idea, they get all excited and pumped up, and they're ready to do it. They go back to the world where they live, and life takes over, and they just don't get to it. So it's a kind of a cycle of fire, you know, that you light a fire and then it goes out. You go back to a conference, you light the fire and then it goes out. So what we're talking about doing is having a way to light the fire and bank it, keep it going. And when you get home, stoke it up and it'll come up again, it'll flame up, and you can begin to work on things. And we show you how to do that by creating these teams of professional learners that Heather talks about so well. So this is the way that we've observed it happening in the world. Get excited and then forget about it. Get excited and then forget about it. And what we want to do is get excited and then maintain a level, given the tools to do so, maintain a level of interest over time and put it into motion. And then when you go back to the conference, you can get excited at another level. You can go deeper, you can go higher, you can learn more, and then that begins to feed itself. So it's a virtuous cycle as opposed to this negativity that can find its way into your life if you don't.
How has changed writing this book together your own practice and your own approach to education?
Well, for me, I was greatly privileged when I met Heather and she introduced me to the concept of professional learning communities. It changed my life because I knew something about how to learn and I was always excited to talk about it, but I didn't think about it in terms of organizational learning or team-based learning. And we had a team that we were trying to put together, a group of colleagues of ours. And Heather brought this to the table and I said, you've got to do this. You've got to put this in our team. And it was, as I say, life-changing, for not only for me, but for the whole team.
Well, and at that time, we were a new team. 3 of the 4 had been just hired for this newly created position in our college, and Terry was our team leader. And so we were all trying to learn about each other and this new process that was being created. So it was a good time to do this because we were just starting something new. And one of the other colleagues, we came straight from the K-12 world. So I pretty much just came with what I was doing, you know, as a 7th grade teacher. But it was really amazing to me because PBL was new to me. I was very uncomfortable with it at first, to be perfectly honest. But it took us a while. It took us about 5 years to write this book because I knew PLC, but I had to deeply understand PBL to find those connections and vice versa for Terry. You know, it took a while for us to be able to really see the connection that was inherently there. And we were blessed to have this wonderful colleague, Dr. Bob Aker, who is one of the original framers of the PLC at Work method. And he's been a professor here on this campus for 40 years. He just happened to leave the year I started. And of course, he saw it.
Yes, so we would go out to dinner, Bob and a group of older professors. We go out to dinner on Tuesday nights. So I always say that I have my own version of Tuesdays with Maury. If you remember that book, it's Tuesdays with Bob. But he was the one who said, "Hey Terry, you've got to bring PBL into the world of PLC." And he started me thinking about that. And of course, I talked with Heather, and we decided there's a marriage here that goes deeper than either PLC or PBL can go by itself. So there is a kind of, I talked about metacognition before, this is like meta teamwork. You know, it just goes deeper and deeper and deeper, to where we eventually came up with this notion that if we included PBL thinking in the regular process of PLC, then it would improve the functionality of those professional learning communities, and at the same time it would improve the thinking of the team members. And this developed into PBL becoming more than just a way of teaching and more than just a way of learning, but more of a way of thinking. So as you practice PBL in the groups or in your classroom, you become more used to the concept of PBL and how it works, and you begin to use PBL in your daily life. And then that's the power of what we call the PBL mindset. And that became the kernel of truth that this whole book was built upon.
And I could act, because the original question that started this conversation was, how has this changed our lives? What he just said is something that I'm seeing in practice. I spend a lot of time working with schools. I do a lot of consulting work, and I love that opportunity to grow and learn with these individual schools. And I use this method of helping them with their problem of practice. And I see it in the principals and the leadership team that I'll work with in these different schools, that no longer are they just throwing darts at a dartboard and, well, let's just try this, well, let's try this. It causes them to really focus in and not have solutionitis, but to really dig deep, figure out what is the root cause of the problem, and then they know where to address their efforts. And I see that with so many different leaders, and they say that it's really affected their ability to do their job and empowered them. It's improved their self-efficacy and the collective efficacy of the school, which, according to Hattie's work, is the #1 factor that affects student learning.
And
Yeah, it's powerful.
Just one last thing. One of the things that we notice is that our relationship to each other and to our team members is deeper, much deeper than it would normally be amongst a group of colleagues. There's a trust that develops because we use PLC, because we are professional learners, that we have to depend upon each other interdependently. We have to work together. We cannot do this alone. And we've learned that, and it makes our relationships to each other much deeper, much more trusting, and much more effective as a result.
Yeah, I think this is so important because I observed that firsthand, that the faculties, whether in education or other faculties, they're so political. And sometimes I could see from far, there are two colleagues, they despise each other like it's. And I think what I have seen so far, I think it's probably the most political space you can be working in. There is so much jealousy as well, because I think it also has to do with the nature of education and higher education, because you're there, you're esteemed, and it's about knowledge, and it's about not explicitly but implicitly it's about I know something, and therefore I have authority. And so I'm not judging, I'm just observing that it's very, very political. There is no school I have been to that I haven't seen that, and it's, I think, in many ways detrimental to the students, and let alone to the staff as well. So why do you think is that? Why do you think it is so contentious? Except if you have a process as you implemented it in your faculty, which is really kudos to you. Because I think really I can feel that between you and really the way you talk about your colleagues, that you really have a gift that you cherish, that is really relationship and the connection, the deep connection that you were able to foster.
Over the years, Yanik, that I've been here at MTSU, Middle Tennessee State, I've been here about 20 years, and so I've discovered that I can reach across campus because there are good people all over, but there are people who are interested in using problem-based learning in their teaching. There's been a lot of interest in that because it's a great way to teach and learn, and it's very useful, especially at the higher ed level, to train and to teach. But so people will reach out to me to say, hey, help me figure out how to do this. And so I've been able to make connections with good people across campus, and over time a network kind of emerges of people who would like to trust each other, like to work together. And so you can't get rid of all of the systemic individualism that exists at higher education, because it's built upon this whole idea of publishing and perishing and becoming expert in your field. And so there's a lot of systemic individualism that results in jealousies and competitions and all that. But there are people in that university, I'll guarantee you, across all kinds of disciplines, that would want to work together, enjoy the interaction between people at a deeper level. And this kind of approach, the PLC approach and the problem-based learning approach, appeals to people who value that human connection. They're not going to be everybody, but it's going to be a lot. So we're discovering that. And Bob Aker wrote a book. Bob Aker and Deborah Sells wrote a book called A New Day that you might be interested in.
A New Way.
A New Way. I'm sorry. I'm thinking of Star Wars.
Yeah, very good.
A New Way. And it's about how to use professional learning communities at the higher education level, which is very interesting.
And I want to get back to the main thing that you were talking about in your question. I want to make sure I add, and he brought it up also, about trust. And if you read Patrick Lencioni's book, The 5 Dysfunctions of a Team, he talks about that there's 5 things, and it's a pyramid of things that affect one another. And at the base of that pyramid, the main reason that teams have dysfunction is because of a lack of trust. And he talks about the need for vulnerability-based trust. And I think that is truly at the root of any relational problem that you have. Trust is somewhere in that.
Right.
And I think that at the beginning, when I talked about myself as a professional learner, when you get a DR in front of your name, as I say it, and you earn those credentials, you're supposed to know so much more. But what I've noticed is the more I learn, the more I recognize that I don't know, and that there's so much more to learn. And so I personally have no problem entering a collaborative team and being very vulnerable with the team about what I don't know. And because of that, I feel like I let go of some of that I don't know what it is. It's an exterior that's trying to hide your insufficiencies.
It's an insecurity.
It
really.
is insecurity, yes. And I think that when you can let go of that insecurity and embrace the fact that I don't know a lot of things, but I'd like to learn with you professionally, let's learn together. I think that that is one reason that I feel comfortable even entering into collaboration with so many different people.
Mm-hmm. Daniel Pink, I just recently saw a video that Daniel Pink put out, and he said that the most powerful 3 words that an educator can have are "I don't know," and so that lets the learner understand that I'm not above you as a teacher. We are learners. I may know more than you know. You may know more than I know. We're learners in this life. And so there is a power that you can have when you release power. Mm-hmm. It becomes stronger. So it's not positional power anymore. It's what we call referent authority. That is, it's people who give you trust because you give trust. People give you love because you give love. I mean, it's all this relationship. Everything is built upon trust. So learning is built upon trust as well. And this is one of the things that Heather brought to our group, was this notion of working on, not just saying it, not just falling into that intention gap trap, but saying, all right, we are going to admit that we don't know things. We're going to do this intentionally, and then we're going to work together to find the answers that we need, and then everybody grows. Mm-hmm. And so we have to break down those walls of insecurity and the walls of ego, and just say, hey, we're human beings, we don't know it all, but we want to learn.
Mm-hmm. There's a chapter in the book where we talk about willpower, the will to work collaboratively. And in that book, one of the things we highlight is, actually it's the light bulb that you see on the front of our book. And it was about coming to the PLC light, L-I-G-H-T. And that acronym stands for the fact that we listen to learn. That's the I. And then we integrate the learning of others into our own understanding. And by doing that, the G is we grow. We grow professionally. We grow as a team. And then the H and the T work together, and that is where you honor and you trust the process that you're going through, and you honor and trust the people that you're going through the process with. And so that's a really big part of growing your skills to be able to collaborate.
I can really attest to this, because the most fun when you're a teacher is when you actually collaborate with a colleague. It makes it so much fun because kids also have fun. And, my absolute favorite is Dr. Rashida Suleiman, because we always did projects together, interdisciplinary. And this was just something up to now, I truly cherish. And we all the time, we talk about our past, experiences. And that's really because it disseminates, right? It affects it. You instill this desire for learning, the desire of connection, relationship. And really, as you mentioned, it's all ultimately comes down to trust, right? And I think trust is so undervalued, because that's really the currency that keeps our societies together. So how do you foster trust?
Okay.
It's very simple. You do what you say you're going to do, right? And so when we collaborate, we are co-laboring, right? Let's look at the root of the word. It's about laboring together. And so when we say we're going to do something, we do it. And if we can't do it, either because we're not physically able or something happens to prevent us, we don't try to hide that. We're up front. Preferably, before we don't do it, we let them know, hey, I'm actually not going to be able to fulfill my commitment. And maybe I ask for help. That's part of that vulnerability-based trust. This is not about creating some activity where we're going to go, learn to trust each other out.
Do ropes courses.
It would be fun. I would be good with that.
She wanted us to do an escape room, and I said I can't do that. 'Cause I have claustrophobia. So we went bowling.
But that's not how we built trust. That's how we had fun together, right, as a team.
Yeah.
The trust was built by laboring together. And through that process, we learned together. We learned about the work we were doing. We learned about each other.
Mm-hmm.
What are some of the best problem-based learning experiences that you face with a PLC? So let's just put the two concepts together, problem-based learning and really PLC.
Do you wanna?
Well, I can start us.
Yeah, you go ahead.
And then you can take it over. We've done several. We've done a lot of imagining a problem. The way that we do it is that, there's a structure to creating a PBL unit. There are 8 elements to it, but think of it this way. Teaching is normally content-based, and you have to come to the content. With problem-based learning, it's problem-based, and you bring the content to the problem. So what we would do, the main thing that we did together was training new teachers. So we would look at the world around us, the world of teaching practice, and say, what are the problems that are out there? Let's just talk about the context. And we begin to list the kinds of things that we observe, and not say, well, the problem is this. The problem is test scores are too low. Okay, that's a problem, but as Heather mentioned earlier, that's not the problem. That's not the root cause. That's a symptom. That's an outcome. So we would look at the world around us and say, what are the symptoms that we see? And when we got that together, we would say, what problem does that manifest? How is that manifested? What is the root of that? And so then we would, once we had figured out what we wanted to address, then we would figure out a creative way of framing the problem so that our audience, our teacher candidates, would be interested in it and engaged in it. So there's a writing component, kind of a storytelling component. And all we're doing is telling the story of a real person. So, for example, there's a young, you want to do eyes in the mirror, or you want to talk
No, you
about
go ahead.
Charlie?
You go ahead.
So let's talk about one that we call Making Charlie Smile. So it is the story of a young girl she's 15 years old. She's coming in to school, and she's all engaged and happy, and suddenly she undergoes a change. We see this all the time in schools, that children are an enigma. We don't know what's going on in their life. And so we have to be able as teachers to know how to break the code, how to be able to look into a child's life and know what is happening and what is affecting their learning. What's making them shut down? Well, Charlie was shutting down. And so we wrote this story about Charlie with embedded information that our teacher candidates could look at and draw clues from and say, well, I think this, or I wonder this, and then they would go and research it and say, oh, I'm learning about ADHD, or I'm learning about dyslexia, or I'm learning about home abuse, or I'm learning about single parents. All the things that we wanted them to understand, we could build into a story. Charlie's not the only one, but we wanted their minds to focus on how do you make Charlie engage in learning again. Mm-hmm. And this was particularly a powerful one because after our students graduated and were out there teaching, I saw a tweet from back when Twitter was tweeting. I saw a tweet from one of our students that said, I know you're not going to,
This was someone who had just started their first year of teaching.
first year of teaching, she said, I know you all are not going to understand what I'm saying here, but today I made Charlie smile. And to me, that was just a lightning bolt of enthusiasm that went over me, because that's what we wanted, was for them to be able to see into students, see into their lives, and be able to assist, to help, as a teacher wants to do. So we were giving them, through that story, tools on how to diagnose and ideas about how to get help for a particular student in a particular situation.
So with our prospective teachers that we're working with, most of them were really good students in their lifetime. And so they're used to someone saying, well, here's the problem, now go research how to solve it. And what we're trying to teach teacher candidates is that's not how the classroom works. Instead, you have all these different symptoms going on all around you, and you've got to find a diagnosis for those symptoms. And so we're trying to teach them a method of doing that. But when I work in schools where the teachers they're already professionals, the way that I use the PBL model is the mindset for success is I'm not making up fictional stories based on real life. I'm taking the real life that's happening and I'm asking them to, let's talk about what we see. So if I'm working with an instructional leadership team, usually that involves the principal, the assistant principals, instructional coaches that are in the classrooms or they're in the team meetings regularly. And so we will sit down and our conversations revolve around the learning grid that we have in our book, which is just 4 quadrants, and then in the center is the problem of practice. And we don't start here, we start on those outer edges. And so usually we might say it's an elementary school, which in our area is often kindergarten through 5th or 6th grade. So we'll start with kindergarten. What do you know that's going on in kindergarten? And so each of the people at the table will start sharing things, and we're just making a list in the grid. And that'll lead someone to say, well, I think something else. I think they've got a really good attitude about such and such. And then someone else will say, but I don't think they quite know how to do something else. So we'll put that in the quadrant also. And we're organizing our thoughts. And then after we've exhausted our thoughts on kindergarten, we'll move to 1st grade. And we go through all the teams in the building. And at the end of that, I will just simply say to them, so what's the problem? And after those conversations, you see them talking, well, I think the problem right now is, and they will have conversations, they're digging deeper till finally they'll say, okay, I think this is a manageable problem that we're dealing with. And from that, we'll have conversations. How are we going to address this problem of practice? It could be that myself or someone else is going to do a training on a specific thing for some of the teachers. Some of the others may receive some other source of assistance. Sometimes it's a simple thing like we just need to keep doing what we're doing because we know we learn by doing. So we just need more practice in this thing that we're working on, and we're going to monitor that practice, and we'll come back in a few weeks to look at it. But the most empowering part of this is they are able to really identify what problem of practice that they are needing to address at that moment. And it's really helping them to organize their thoughts around that.
So what you're seeing here is the difference between what we call teaching with PBL and learning with PBL. So what Heather is describing is what we have come to describe as dynamic PBL. PBL that is based on what's happening right now in real life. And this is a relatively new application of the PBL method. And it takes it from a simulation to actual practice. And this leap from theory to practice is the thing that builds that PBL mindset that we were talking about earlier. So once these teachers have had these deep conversations about what they think they know, and they're recording this on that learning grid, they have become a community of learners and a community of practice just by the nature, just by the very fact that they have been required to think and to work together as a community to list the facts. So it's so simple, but it's so rare for people to be able to just say, all right, what are the facts? They want to jump to analysis right away. We don't want analysis. Let's just list facts. We'll do analysis later. So that's part of the grid. What are the facts? It's one of the hardest things for people to do, is to just say, here is something that's happening. Here's an observation. They almost need to learn how to rethink the way they look at life and stop being, going so fast in their head to jumping to solutions. So this is what Heather calls solutionitis. Is that what you said?
I didn't call it that, but that's,
Yeah.
I didn't coin that term.
So, yeah, so you get people working together like that, and suddenly you have a school full of staff and teachers who are together learning to address a common problem that they have identified together. And even if they decide to do what they've been doing, one of the things that this gives them is a criterion for how to judge if what they're doing is working. Mm-hmm. Because they've gone through this process together and they've said, well, this is the problem, this is what we're doing, we think it works, we're just not doing it well enough. So they're going to have that conversation again. They're going to say, okay, we've been doing this better, and here's how we did it better, and it's working or it's not. And so then that conversation is happening, and you're having what Peter Senge called a learning organization.
And this really leads what you mention in the book, and unpack this precisely, it leads to clarity, and you give this really powerful method how to actually go through it, with having a vision, a mission, goals, that you can really address it, and then you can go from there. That is fact-based, but it is really powerful how you actually describe it. So unpack this, why clarity is so important, and why you should have a vision, the mission and goals. They have to be constantly highlighted in order for you to really address the core issues.
So that's foundational in the PLC at Work model. And when you talk about that model that was developed by Richard DeFore and Robert Aker in 1998 originally, and it has grown since then, they talk about these 4 pillars on which the PLC at Work model rests. And it began, they work together. They're not in conflict one another. And so there's this mission that all students should learn, all of them. And so that's what the whole concept is built on, learning for all. And there's a vision that the school would have that is built towards alignment to that mission. And if that's what our vision is, then we have to learn to act a certain way, and that's where our values line up. And then from those values, we develop goals. And those goals are very specific. They use the SMART goal acronym that they didn't develop, but it comes out of the business world. And that we develop goals that we can measure. And we do measure them. It's not a goal for the year that at the end of the year we're going to do this. We might make those stretch goals, but we also make individual goals for the unit of study that we're on right now. And when we finish this unit of study, we measure the goals. Where are we on attaining that goal? And from that, we go to a next goal for our next unit of study. But it's very much oriented on focusing on the results, not on intentions. We intend for everyone to learn, but did they? And so if they didn't, well, what are we going to do to ensure that that happens? So we're not hoping for success. We are doing the work to measure our success and then laboring towards creating the goals that we have set for ourselves.
How do you respond to someone who says that it simply doesn't work, given the fact that we are not really a team, we don't have the culture, therefore it all sounds great, it all sounds fantastic, and you wrote a beautiful book, but eventually it's it's not implementable in our schools?
Sure.
Well, I think one of the first things that we've learned from Bob Aker is that there is a tremendous value to having leadership in the school from the top. So this is the big difference that we were talking about earlier about higher education and the autonomy that professors expect at higher education, and in the K-12 world, the pre-K-12 world, there is an expectation that principals are in charge and superintendents are in charge. So there's much more conformity that they can say it and you'll do it. So it's a different world. So it's very important in the PLC world for there to be buy-in by the leadership of the school and hopefully by the district, and you can talk about that.
Right. Absent of good leadership, the PLC practices are not sustainable. You are going to have pockets of success in a school with a team where members of the team are really bought into doing the work. But if the leadership is not supportive of that and does not create the system that allows for it, it will not sustain.
So when she says create the system that allows for it, what she's talking about is that the leader has to build in time within the school day for teachers to have to PLC together. And not only that, but there has to be a format that is respected and expected of those PLC teams. You must do this, you must produce that. So there's not a great deal of leeway in the system in that regard. So we talk about things that are loose and tight. So there are some things you can be loose about. You can have wiggle room. You can have there's room for individuality. But there are some things that are so important that we must be tight. We must not allow any deviation from this central process that will allow the space for teachers to be successful within. There have to be walls. It's really hard for me as a PBL person to envision walls, but there have to be some boundaries, some borders, some controls. And this is one thing I learned from this lady right here.
Well, and specifically, if we're if we're supposed to collaborate with one another, but our schedule is not built to have that time during the workday, then you're just planning on us finding the time somewhere in our personal time. And that's not going to be conducive.
That's not the way to build culture.
And it's not sustainable, because perhaps this year I'm able to do that. The first year we worked together, I didn't have a child. The second year I had a newborn baby, and so I couldn't work outside of my contractual time. I had to be at home, right? And I shouldn't be expected to do that. And so the leadership must build in the time for them to work together, but we have to say these words. Just because you build time for people to co-labor together does not mean they will co-labor on the right things. And so it's very important that the leadership is explaining and is inspecting what they expect and making sure that they are doing the work that is necessary to help all students learn at high levels.
So when you have a principal who expects this to work and they follow up and they are consistent then you are, by what Heather said earlier, you are building trust because you're doing what you said you'd do. And so when they set the groundwork for this, we're going to be a PLC school. We're going to make it work. There's no question about that. That's tight. Here's how we're going to do it. You're going to bring forth these products. There's no looseness about that. But there is room within there for creativity, for problem solving, and the expectation is for creativity and problem solving and wiggle room and humanity. But it's within these bounds. And that is possible in the K-12 world, harder in the higher education world, but still doable. It has to be whosoever will, let them come kind of a thing.
Right.
And we really come back to really trust the process, right? Especially when it comes to this process, right? And again, we gotta trust these two wonderful people. So now I invite everyone really to go on solutiontree.com and order a copy of Mindset for Success by Terry Goodin and Heather K. Dillard. Dr. Heather K. Dillard. Such a pleasure. And so what frustrates you most when it comes to those kind of processes? Because of course I believe and I see the synergy, the symbiosis that you really have with one another. It's really tangible. But there are certainly also times that you really struggle and that you think like, you know what, it will have been so much easier just to write my own book, just to put it into my words, put it down, get it published. It's hard. So tell us, share a little bit your frustrations, if you don't mind.
I don't get frustrated with her. Here's the thing. We have had to learn that she looks at the world from one point of view and I from another. She's more type A and I'm not. She's more structured and I'm not. But, we are different. We have different personalities. I wait to the last minute and get things done, and she is more on top of it and wanting to get things going. She wants to schedule a meeting, and I want to say, well, let's just think about that. And so I know I drive her crazy, but
I probably drive him crazy too.
very rarely she drives me crazy. I think, oh, she wants another meeting. But it's all okay. We've learned how to strengthen each other and how to approach this, appreciating the differences in our work style and in our strengths and weaknesses. So I see my strengths in creativity, for example, and free thinking and wildness, and she sees her strength, I think, in that, but also in actually getting something on paper.
Well, that was one of the problems that we had when we first started writing together. We'd been working together for a long time, but not writing together. And I was very, I just put words on the paper. I don't worry about if they look pretty. I'm trying to get thoughts on paper so that he can read it and have my thoughts. It's kind of like, a band instructor. I can imagine if they're trying to get students to play a note and the students are too nervous to do it out loud, right? They need to hear it so they can fix it. And so when we were writing, Bob Aker was such a wonderful friend to us, and he would say, send me some of your writing and I'll give you feedback. And Terry was so nervous to give our writing to his dear friend, Bob. And I just said, Bob, you just got to put something on paper. Let him have something. And I think that was really hard for him to let go of it,
It's always hard for me to turn loose of anything written because I want to check it again, and make sure it's all beautiful. And Heather was like, just do it. So I had to modify my behavior.
And also, like, simply the way you express yourself, right? It's how you form a sentence, right? It might mean the same thing, but you just articulate it differently. Did you have any challenges in this way? Because it can be very different because our brains are different wired. And how did all this unfold?
Yes, that was a problem. Not a problem, it was a challenge in the beginning because he's a much more eloquent writer. He's got a much wider vocabulary than I do.
See how nice she is.
Well, I'm telling the truth. I'm being vulnerable here. and But I was okay with letting him fix my words. And what's interesting right now is because a lot of times as we go back and read the book, I can go to a place and say, oh, that was my thought, or that was his thought. But there's so many that I'm like, I'm not really sure who wrote this part.
Yeah, we became a two-headed writer.
Yes, but it took a while
Yeah.
because we divided and conquered at first just to get some things on paper,
Yeah.
and then we would look at each chapter and really work them together.
Yeah, we did. And she was really great about when we would meet. We wrote a lot of this at the coffee shop. So we would meet and she would have her computer out and I'd be talking and she would say, okay, wait a minute, say that again. And so she was writing it all down and she said, well, what'd you say 2 minutes ago? And I'm like, I don't know. So we'd have to back up and do that again. And then we'd have it and we'd start, it was malleable. We would start forming it together. So we really did become one mind working on this. And I knew that she would be thinking about going in this direction, and she knew that I would be thinking about this, and so we would be able to just share that and talk and say, well, this is what's important from a PBL point of view, and she would say, well, this is what's important from a PLC point of view, and we began to be able to just blend, and it got easier and easier as we went along. And I still could have my moments of editorial precision that I wanted to have, and she could go ahead and get everything down. So we worked it out.
Mm-hmm. But I do think it's one reason it took us so long to write the book. We were both experts, if you will, in our own topic, but we just couldn't see how they overlaid without laboring through that process.
Yeah, it was a job. It was really a job because PBL is a big field.
PLC is a big
PLC
world.
is a big field.
Mm-hmm.
And so you're talking about bringing two big ideas together and trying to distill it down to where it's not overwhelming. And that was hard to do. But when we got that focal point, it came together in that learning grid. And the idea of here is the essence of the method that will make PLC better. This is where PBL contributes, and here's where PLC contributes to the effectiveness of PBL in that collaborative working. It all focused down to that laser point, and that was what was the power of the book.
Right. And even though it was written for the K-12 world, I think it's applicable in any field because so much of the PLC work came out of the business world.
I fully agree. This is such a powerful synthesized book that I really use every day, also in my teaching practice, because it really helps me so much to just get, when it comes to worksheets and so on for my students, just to be so much more clearer, and also to make it more feasible also for my students, because oftentimes we just get somehow bogged down by details, and so it really narrows things down, and you can really produce in a way that I think has tremendously changed my practice, and also I think really my students learning. So this is a really powerful book. So therefore, I really invite everyone who is listening right now to go on solutiontree.com to buy a copy of Mindset for Success by Dr. Terry Goodin and Dr. Heather Dillard. So what do you do to rejuvenate besides your academic work?
Boy, that's a big question, Yanik. It is a challenge to rejuvenate. One of the things that I think we have to do, we've talked about this a lot, is to focus upon self-care and to intentionally do things that are rejuvenating to our mind and to our body and to our spirit. It's so important to do that, and it's easy when you are working on something that you have a passion about to lose track of taking care of yourself. So when we think about this thing with PLC, light, L-I-G-H-T, and the first thing is listening to learn, well, that's the essence of PBL. Listen to learn. And it's others focused, others focused, others focused. So everything that I do tends to be to benefit someone, and I forget to take care of me. So I have to figure out a way to refill the cup, is what you tell me, so that I can have something to pour. So Heather has done a great job of telling me what to do, giving me ideas from Tina Bogren,
yes, and Timothy Kanold.
And Tim Kanold. And so she got me to reading about that and to thinking about what you can do. I haven't mastered that, but
Me either.
But I'm aware of it, and that's the beginning. That's the beginning of our learning cycle. So at this age, I'm still learning.
Yes, me too. And hey, I want to say something about Timothy Kanold and Tina Bogren's work, Educator Wellness, and it's also a solution tree product. But there is a concept that Tim Kanold talks about in his book Heart. And there's this quadrant with 4 quadrants, and it talks about where you want your energy to be. There's high and low, positive and negative, and we would like to be in the high positive quadrant all the time. But the truth is, if we don't allow ourselves time in the low positive quadrant, we're going to end up in the low negative quadrant. So if we try to stay at these highs all the time, but yet we don't give ourselves time to just be serene and mindful of just quiet, then we are going to get to a place where we lose hope. And so we've got to make time for that. And so for me, it's an everyday thing. You know, my alarm clock goes off way before my husband and my daughters because I need that time alone in my quiet time to be prayerful, to read. And that's what fuels me throughout the day.
And I grew up, Yanik, in the woods of West Virginia. And so what I enjoy is that sense of serenity that I found while I was sitting there. You go into the woods and it's very quiet because all the animals shut up when you go into the woods. They all quiet down. But if you'll sit down and sit there, after about 20-30 minutes, the chipmunks start coming back out and the birds start singing again. And things begin to get back to normal. They figure, okay, he's not a threat. He's part of us now. So I find that those kinds of moments are rejuvenating for me. And so I make an effort to find that place in my mind. So for me, it's writing poetry. I love writing. It's writing poetry. It's listening to music. It's hanging out at the coffee shop. It's talking to people that I think I might love. And I find out, yeah, I do. They're cool. So, you know, so that is rejuvenating. So being a kind of an introverted people person is the way that I find, you know, a self-understanding. I like to be alone, but I like to be with people. You know, what's up with that? So the coffee shop is a great place. And I remember when I'm at the coffee shop, I remember the woods. I remember the feel of the breeze. I remember the sound of the wind rustling in the pine trees. And so those are the things that take me away, that give me a sense of replenishment, so that then I can go and do the things that, you know, I really do like to do, but there's a lot of stress.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, the US is such an amazing place. That's why, you know, everyone, especially I as a European, we all dream of the United States of America. It's beautiful. You just have everything there. It's such an inspiring place, and I can feel that. But what I also hear of you is really that you are on purpose. I think you don't really, what you do is really truly integrated of who you are. You do really, your work is really based on your values, based on your goals, your mission, and ultimately vision. Does this somehow sound familiar?
Yes, absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
It would be hard to separate the two, because we've come to a place where we're doing what we love to do. It gets stressful, but we do love doing it. So it's kind of feeding sort of a perpetual energy kind of a thing.
Absolutely.
How do you think people can find their true purpose and meaning in life as you have?
Well, now that's a deep question. And you know, there's a lot of different ways you could answer that question, right? Perhaps they could use the problem-based learning method.
I was going to say that. It's, you know, Heather asked me earlier today, when did you become a problem-based learning person? And I said when I was little. I think going back to our earliest times, when we had this wonderful sense of appreciating the future, and to just imagine ourselves as children again, and the question becomes why. When my son was little, we'd ride down the road, and he would be asking me thousands of why questions, and most of which I didn't know. You know, why is the sky blue? Well, I told him it's because it was nitrogen, but I'm wrong about that. I know that now. It's more complicated than that. But the point is, if we can go back to that time when we were asking why, I think that's where it all starts. And it is a PBL mindset that children have. They'll ask you questions that require you to be a physicist to answer. And what they're getting at is why. So if we can start there, no matter how old we are now, if we can revert to that simplistic view of the world, to look inside ourselves and to look at the world around us and just say, why? Why is it this way? And then allow time for your brain to work on it. And allow for that to happen, and then begin to think, how can I modify my world to feel more serene, to feel more at peace? What do I need to do? Where do I need to reach out? And what do I need to protect? And those are the things that I think we can do. No matter what age we are, we can always come back to that little simple question, why?
And it reminds me of something I heard an educator say once, and I don't even remember who said this, but it was really powerful. And she said, stop asking children, what do you want to be when you grow up? Instead, ask, what problems do you want to solve? And I love that concept of us really thinking about, you know, what problems do I want to play a role in helping find the solution for? And it's a great way to find your purpose. Is where is my passion? What problems do I really feel that I can contribute to and have a desire to do that? When I work with doctoral candidates and they're trying to determine what is their dissertation topic going to be, I tell them it needs to be something you care about knowing the answer to. Because if you don't care what the answer to your question is, you're going to lose interest in it. And it's going to be way more laborious than it has to be. But if you care about the problem you're trying to solve, then you won't mind doing the work that's required to finish that dissertation.
Lastly, what makes you feel truly alive?
That is tied into what I was just talking about for me. Um, to feel truly alive is to feel connected, because life is not just within me, it's within the whole of the world around me. So if I feel, if I sense, you have your senses. And if I'm thinking about what's going on right around me, then I feel connected to it. So for example, I said I like to write poetry. Well, I never wrote much haiku until just recently. And so I realized, somebody introduced me or could encourage me to do so. And so I realized when I was doing that I was having to distill my observations based upon my senses down to a 3 lines poem, with a certain number of syllables, 575. So I was doing that, and in doing it, I was listening, I was feeling, I was seeing, I was tasting, I was touching. It was the world around me, the life around me, that made me feel alive. And as long as I feel that, I'm good.
And my answer would be this. When I was a young girl, there was a song that I remember hearing sang, and the words stated, if I can help somebody as I go along, then my living shall not be in vain. And that song, I haven't heard it probably in 20, 30 years, but I've never forgotten it. And I truly believe that if what I'm doing is helping someone, then my purpose is being fulfilled. That I'm not here on this earth to fulfill for myself. It's not about me. It's about others. And that's why I'm here. And as long as I have breath, it's to help someone in some way. And that's what causes me to feel like that I can rest at night.
Dr. Goodin, and Dr. Dillard, thank you so much for being a gift for myself and really to the world.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Yanik.
This has been a lot of fun.
Dr. Goodin and Dr. Dillard. That's why knowledge matters. Make your life a masterpiece. Visit now programs.the-ykm.com. Meant to make you grow.